All right, welcome everybody to the second installment of the Arkansas Native Plant Society's 2024 webinar series. We're excited to have Dr. Richard Abbott back again this year to share his knowledge with us. I believe this is the third year in a row Dr. Abbott has been part of our webinar series, or maybe fourth actually. But today we'll be learning about opposite-leaved woody species of Arkansas. Dr. Abbott is an assistant professor of biology at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, where he is also the curator of the university herbarium. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Just ask that you keep your microphones muted unless you have a question you'd like to ask Dr. Abbott, which time you can unmute your microphone and ask, or you can place your question in the chat and I'll make sure that he sees it. If you'd like to learn more about the Arkansas Native Plant Society, I encourage you to visit our website, anps.org, or you can follow us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Arkansas Native Plant Society. Then we also have that YouTube channel I mentioned earlier, and I'll drop a link to it in the chat here shortly. If you're not a member of Native Plant Society, I really encourage you to join. Joining is pretty simple. You can go to our website, anps.org/join, where you can use your PayPal account to join online today, or you can mail a check in to our treasurer, and the treasurer's name and address is on that website I just mentioned. And I'll drop these links in the chat for you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Richard Abbott. Again, thank you, Dr. Abbott, for being here. We're really looking forward to hosting you once again.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Eric. So as most of y'all have already been familiar with, my kind of interest or specialty is trying to figure out how to put names on plants, and something I spent more than 30 years of my life doing in several different states and countries. And so this approach that we're going to talk about here, while it's Arkansas focused, it's a pattern. It's one of these approaches that I've seen actually works globally. No matter where I've been, where I've gone, it allows me to walk up to plants. And so I think basically as an introduction, that's kind of what I'm trying to do here today is to share one of my approaches to how I organize botanical information, how I go about trying to deal with this overwhelming diversity of species out there, right? And so if there are any questions, I don't mind you asking. Please, figure out how to interrupt me or how to put it into the chat box or follow up later. But the plan basically is to spend the first few minutes doing a review. After the last presentation, there were a few people that asked me to please go back and review the basics. So first few minutes of basic review, and then we're going to do a kind of a quick overview of the opposite-leaved woody plants in Arkansas. What I've prepared in addition to the presentation that you're going to see here today, there is a much fuller presentation that actually goes through most of the species, all the genera, all the families, and actually addresses some of the more difficult groups like Fraxinus and Acer, and some of the groups that people struggle with. We have separate presentations for that, tied to that, but there just won't be time to talk about everything today. So as always, please follow up. Please let me know if you'd like a PDF version of today's talk. Happy to share that with you. But anyway, with that, I'll go ahead and move forward with the next bit of this here. And basically this idea of just kind of reminding ourselves what I mean by a motif, right? When we talk about something like MADCap, this is the mnemonic device. It stands for maples, ashes, dogwoods, and cap is short for capifoliaceae, the honeysuckles, right? So what we're talking about here, what I'm presenting here is this pattern. In this case, it's an artificial pattern. And what we mean by artificial is that these things are not each other's closest relatives. Like natural groups are groups of closely related individuals or species, whereas an artificial group is something that's more for human convenience, right? So it's a teaching tool, basically, right? And the truth is, if you've got a good memory, you don't need these motifs. You can just learn every single family, every genus, every species, all the variation. You can just memorize all that, right? Most of us, our brains can't handle that. So these motifs basically exist as teaching tools, and also for building these reference lists, the ways of trying to be able to have a reference point to come back to when you find yourself confronting some unknown mystery plant, right? So again, today's focus, a little bit of a review for the first few minutes, and then we're going to walk through the opposite-leaved woody species here in Arkansas. This first thing that I wanted to point out here, for some of y'all will remember this idea of when we're dealing with complexity, diversity, this idea of being kind of overwhelmed by the amount of diversity that's out there. And I just want to remind us that no matter how overwhelming you might find the natural world, the number of plant species out there, it's not random. There are patterns, right? And one of these patterns happens to be woody plants with opposite leaves. Right? It's a very useful pattern. And so let's please remember that the reason why I'm talking about this group is it's a useful artificial group. Right? And so we've already in the past talked about a lot of the different patterns and the review stuff is out there. So if you are new or want the review, please look back at some of the previous presentations that I've given in Arkansas and Missouri that have been recorded online. And review that, because I'm going to fly through the next slides pretty quickly. So if you needed the more solid review, please do that and then follow up with questions, right? So again, I'm going to throw a lot of slides at you with lots of words, and that's kind of like, one of these things you're not supposed to do during presentations. But that's because this presentation is also a reference for you to come back to. Right? I have no intention of trying to explain every word on every slide that I'm going to present, right? So come back, study these, follow up with questions. But I did this slide here is just kind of reminding us, why do we have motifs? What's the purpose of a pattern? And the bottom line is motifs vary from person to person and from region to region. But the motifs that I teach are based on 30 plus years of experience, and they work globally. They work in every state I've been, every country I've been. So I'm doing my best to present the information in a way that I found useful. But if your brain wants it to be a little bit different, awesome, cool, right? That's the beauty of these motifs. They can be adjusted to accommodate your interests, right? One of the kind of realities that has to be embraced is if you're going to talk about plants, you've got to learn the vocabulary, right? And so there's no I think all of you are probably very well aware of the fact that when you pick up these books, there's just a lot of words. It's a language. You got to learn the language of botany, right? And so if you need more of that review, again, please look back at some of the other talks. I'm going to skim through a little bit very quickly here. But for me, what we're going to focus on here is how did this motif get developed? Is we've got to remind ourselves of kind of like, what is a plant, right? When the above ground part of a plant is called the shoot, right? You got the below ground part, the root, and the above ground part is called the shoot. And the shoot is the stem and the leaves, right? So the basic growth module of a plant, every plant, no matter how confusing it is, if you take a deep breath and you look at it carefully and you study it, can be broken down into four basic features, like the stem, the node, the leaf, the axillary bud. When we say plant like this, we're actually talking about the seed plants, the vascular plants. We're talking about a specific subset of plants, which I'll touch on more in a minute here. But the plants that you're going to see in the landscape can be reduced to stem, node, leaf, axillary bud. Stem, node, leaf, axillary bud. So when you're trying to, if you're having trouble applying the basics, you got to start here, with this idea that almost every plant you walk up to is going to have a stem. A node is the region on the stem where the leaf is attached, and then you have the axillary bud, which is an embryonic branch. So it's going to grow into a new branch or a modified branch, right? And so the basic plant ID features that I've talked about in the past, and again, please go back and review that if this is new to you. But it's HCAMs, right? We're going to focus on vegetative features, and the mnemonic HCAMs is what I use in teaching, and it stands for habit, composition, arrangement, margin, and stipulus. With these 5 basic characters, I find that more than 80% of families can be diagnosed. You can walk up to most plants and figure out what family or what group it is with these 5 basic characters, and then a few extra things thrown in here, like whether there's pellucid dots or latex and things like that. Flowers, super useful. Fruits as well. But the problem is that most plants are sterile most of the time, right? Most plants don't have flowers and fruits most of the time. So we're going to focus on the shoot, on the stems and leaves, because that's what's present most of the year, right? But that doesn't in any way, shape, or form devalue the importance of flowers. If you have flowers and you want to study flowers, awesome, follow up. But most of the time we don't have those, right? So I'm going to downplay those for now. When we're talking about the 5 basics, the habit, like today's talk is about the woody plants, right? So that the woody is a type of habit. It's referring to growth form, right? And if we ask you the basic question, like, what does it mean to be woody? Right? Most people just say, well, it means has wood, right? And what is wood? Wood is lignified secondary xylem, a specific type of tissue, basically. It's conductive tissue. Xylem is that tissue that carries water and dissolved and nutrients from the roots to the leaves, right? And lignified meaning that it has lignin, secondary meaning that it's basically lateral growth, right? But there are a lot of woody plants that are not called woody, that are not actually woody. Something like a sunflower, the annual sunflowers have more wood per volume than most trees, right? So it's not just having wood that makes you woody, basically. You have to also survive above ground. You have to perennate above ground, right? So this might seem like a straightforward thing when you're dealing with a mature tree or mature shrub or a mature woody vine called liana. It might seem easy to tell if the plant is woody or not. It's when they're juveniles or when they're young that it can be quite difficult to know this within a great certainty, right? But nonetheless, we're going to focus on woody plants because, in part because it's just a very useful category, right? There are books written about woody plants. And so again, the first thing you got to figure out is this plant woody or not? Not always the easiest thing to tell, but that is the starting point. Then we're dealing with the leaf composition, and technically comes next, but composition and arrangement kind of go hand in hand. You can't tell if a leaf is compound or simple without also determining whether it's opposite or alternate at the same time, right? And so leaf arrangement refers to how many leaves there are per node, and I put it first this time because of the purpose of today's talk: woody opposite-leaved plants. So what does it mean to be opposite? 2 leaves at a node, right? So that region of the stem where the leaves attach, if there are 2 leaves typically 180 degrees from each other, that's opposite. The truth is, when I'm teaching, I actually include world as a subset of opposite for one simple reason. Almost every plant that can be opposite will also have some world branches. There will be branches that have world leaves on it. And most species that I've seen that are typically world leaves will also sometimes have nodes that are only opposite, right? So opposite and world kind of sort of go together. They're not really all that different, but it's just basically, are there 2 or more leaves at a node? And if so, that's what I mean by opposite. Leaf composition. For novices who haven't really been trained how to apply the words correctly, most people look at the flat, expanded photosynthetic part of a leaf and call that the leaf, right? But by now, hopefully, we've learned the leaf actually has 3 parts, right? You've got the flat, expanded photosynthetic part is the blade. The stalk at the base is called the petiole. And then in some plants, not all, but in some, we have these paired structures at the base called stipules, which we'll come back to in a minute. But composition, when you're dealing with a leaf that is divided all the way to the midvein so that you have separate little leaflets, that is a compound leaf. And so the woody opposite plants in Arkansas can be simple or compound, but very few are actually compound, right? So things like aesculus, the buckeyes, fractions, the ashes, sambucus, the elderberries, staphylea, the bladdernut, and vitex, which is called vitex or chase tree. These are the compound leaf species of woody plants that we have in Arkansas, right? So being compound and woody and opposite all at the same time, very few things in Arkansas do that, right? So this is the beauty of this approach, is that we're able to narrow all this diversity down into a very small subset. The next part of HCAMs after habit composition arrangement is the margin, and so again, we've talked about this in the past, and so I'm gonna gloss over this today here. But basically, does it have teeth or not? Does the margin have some sort of teeth or lobes, or is it entire, meaning that there's no teeth or lobes there, right? And the final thing here, which becomes an important factor in sorting out these basics, is are stipules present or not? And stipules, again, are paired outgrowths at the base of the petiole, right? They fall off. In most plants, they fall off fairly quickly. And what you end up looking for is scars. So if you look at the Pharyngula caroliniana here at the uppermost node, we can see the red arrow is pointing to this stipule. This narrow brown structure here is the stipule. But the lower 2 nodes, you can see that slight brown scar there. That's where the stipule is attached. So when you're looking for stipules, what you're often looking for is stipule scars. But the holly family here in the middle, this deciduous holly, Ilex decidua, see how it has a small, dark, triangular stipule? That's classic for the holly family, right? The stipules don't usually fall off in the holly family till long after the leaves are gone. But having these persistent, small, dark, triangular stipules is a holly feature. And here to the left with the crataegus, the hawthorn, the stipules are these huge leafy structures, right? So this is a close-up of a stem where we've got the stem in the background with lenticels on it. Here we've got the petiole off to the left. There's the axillary bud. These paired structures coming off. And notice how they're actually attached, in this case here, to the base of the petiole. In the rose family itself, right, the Rosaceae family, it's very, very common for the stipules to actually be fused to the petiole base, not just attached to the stem as well. It does both. It's on the stem, but it's also coming off the petiole base, right? So learning to see stipules is a very important thing to do. Not a huge part of what we're doing here today because very few opposite leaf plants have stipules. We'll talk about those as the last pattern. Okay, I know I'm going fast. Hopefully you're not too fast. This is review, and if you've got questions about this kind of stuff, please follow up or please study the other presentations, right? But also follow up with questions. And those of y'all that sent in the request that I do a review last time, please let me know if this is what you were looking for or if you were looking for a different kind of review, because I do feel like I'm presenting stuff I've already presented before, and I don't want to waste your time that way unless you need it, right? But there are other features to look for besides the 5 basics, and these include things like, is there milky sap or not? Are there pellucid dots, which we'll see on the next slide? Is there a smell if you crush up the leaf? And what is the venation like? Are there petiolar glands? Is there something called glaucus, this bluish-white coating that rubs off, right? So with a handful of additional features, you can walk up to almost any plant and figure out what family or sometimes even genus it is just by using 5 or 6 basic features, which is pretty empowering. So pellucid dots, just mentioned those, are also could be referred to as lycigenous cavities. And what I mean by lycigenous just means formed by the breakdown of something, right? And the lice refer to breaking, the gen referring to the birth of something, right? So these holes in the leaves that are formed by the breakdown of cells. So several cells kind of get together and collectively die, leaving a little hole in the leaf, which is then still filled with chemicals. Pellucid dots, super useful. The citrus family has them. A few legumes like Amorpha will have them. But the St. John's worts, so relevant to today's talk with woody opposite plants. If you walk up to a plant that has opposite simple entire leaves and pellucid dots in Arkansas, you've just found a St. John's wort, a Hypericum. Right? Globally, there's a couple other families that will sometimes do this, right? But for us in Arkansas, if you find woody and opposite with pellucid dots, you've got a St. John's wort, right, in Arkansas. And so learning to recognize the pellucid dots, they usually show up if you hold them up to the light, they'll show up as like clear windows in the leaf, a little circle, the white circles. And then sometimes with reflected light, they'll show up as dark spots, but not always. They don't always show up as dark spots, but sometimes they do. And then another feature to pay attention to is smell. Smell, it turns out the memories associated with smell are the ones that last the longest, and it's the shortest nerves in the body, right, in terms of the major senses, right? And when we're talking about woody opposite plants, most of them don't have smells except for a few of the mints. And so, for instance, beautyberry, which is one of our native mints, actually has kind of a distinctive. It's not the most minty of smells, but it's a strong, distinctive smell. And so, learning to use smell, especially with other groups, is very, very important. Again, not very many woody opposite plants have a smell. Have a strong smell. Venation, the last thing I mentioned here is once again, we're talking about how the veins are arranged, right? So monocots, the major group of plants characterized by having parallel veins versus dicots, which have the branched reticulate veins, right? And if you're reticulate, you can be pinnate or palmate, are all the veins coming from one point at the base, or is it more like a feather with one central mid vein and then secondary veins? Are there 3 strong veins at the base and then kind of pinnate above? If so, that's what I'm calling ply nerve. Or do all the secondaries kind of arch smoothly and curve towards the margin and then towards the apex? It's called arcuate, and it characterizes dogwoods. And so learning to pay attention to venation is another very critical feature that we can add to the 5 basics, right? And so that's the end of the review of the basic stuff here. I don't know if anybody had any questions that I should respond to at this point. I'm going kind of fast, but I'm done with the basic review. No questions? Okay, at least I can tell. So another thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is I'm skimming over this pretty quickly as well, is that understanding phylogeny, understanding relationships, understanding how things are related to each other is a critically important part of this. So for instance, we're using the word plant. If you were asked to define the word plant, what is a plant? I ask my students this every semester, what is a plant? And no one gets it right. And we think we know what plants are. It's one of those words that we've all kind of collectively think we know. They're photosynthetic organisms. No, it turns out most photosynthetic organisms are not actually plants, right? There are lots of plants that are, most plants are photosynthetic, yes, but not all. But where did photosynthesis evolve? In bacteria, right? And they're also photosynthetic protists, right? So there's all kinds of organisms that are not plants that are photosynthetic. So you can't just say photosynthetic organisms equals plants. It's just not true. There's no group. There's no natural group of photosynthetic organisms in that sense, right? And so it turns out that plants are a subset of photosynthetic organisms that are characterized by having a specific type of photosynthesis that was acquired through primary endosymbiosis using chlorophyll A. And so that's a whole separate side lecture to go into that, but please follow up if you have questions on that. But I wanted to be clear here that when we're talking about plants, we're talking about a specific subset of eukaryotes, of organisms, right? And even more precisely than that, we're not looking at the red algae, the green algae. We're not looking at bryophytes. We're not looking at fernallies or ferns. And we're, for the most part, not even talking about gymnosperms, right? For the most part, when we're giving presentations like this one here today, we're actually talking about a subset of the flowering plants, as a subset of plants called flowering plants. And for the most part, we're actually also focusing on a subset of angiosperms, the flowering plants called dicots. Right? And so when we talk about something like woody plants, so narrowing our way back down to this, and you ask yourself a basic question like this: so what does it mean to be woody? Okay, we've already kind of touched on that. This beautiful book that came out a little while back by Ogle et al. Lists 471 woody species in Arkansas. Um, and so, but the question still becomes, well, what is a plant to begin with? What do we mean by woody plant? What do we mean by this? If you pick up other books, they don't list 471 woody plants. They say there's 300 or so woody plants in Arkansas, right? And I was kind of confused by this. Why can't we figure out how many woody plants or how many? Why don't we know how many trees there are in Arkansas, for instance, right? And so I looked at the adjacent state of Missouri, and I found sources saying that there are 119 native tree species in Missouri. But when I looked at the Missouri flora, there were 218 species that are listed as potentially being trees. And then you'll find sources saying that in the U.S. there's 750 trees. Others say no, there's 1,000 trees. And so again, this basic question of here we are trying to put names on trees, on woody plants, on plants, but people don't even agree on the definition of a plant. They don't agree on the definition of a tree or what a woody plant is, right? So how are we supposed to be able to accurately, precisely put names on things when we don't even agree on how to use the words, right? And this is where we have to then embrace this idea of using keys or various patterns as ID tools, right? So if you pick up the Trees of Arkansas, a beautiful little book that was updated by Sundell a while back, you'll find words like, it is evident the leaves of this tree fall each autumn. I can't tell you how many times I've walked up to a tree in the middle of summer and not known for sure whether it was going to be evergreen versus deciduous, right? It's not always evident that the leaves are going to fall off. And yet most keys, if you look at this key over here, start off leaves evergreen, leaves not evergreen. How are you supposed to know if the tree is deciduous unless you already know the tree, right? It's not easy, and yet keys require you to make that call. And then if you read on the fine print, all these little weasel words in the fine print, right? It's very clear that sometimes the key features, like having spines or having fruits or flowers, won't be present part of the year. The problem that I'm getting at here, or addressing here, is the idea that keys, these tools, these identification tools that have been written to help us put names on plants, don't always work. And this is where the motifs come in useful, right? The motifs become very handy ways of asking ourselves, okay, I don't know whether it's evergreen or not. I don't know if it's going to have spines or not. I don't know if it's going to have fruits or not. I don't know anything about those details here, but I've got these patterns that I can fall back on, right? So motifs work really well. They complement really well the keys because they allow you to work your way through the key and to have reference points, right? And so I'm going to quickly revisit this idea of even just using trees as an example here of the discord that we have. There's no single agreed definition for something like this, right? There are people that talk about them having a single trunk or being how tall they are, how broad the trunk is, right? But the truth is most people, when they to identify a woody plant, are looking at bark. Right? Most people, if they see a green twig, are going to say, oh, that's an herb. It's got a green twig. Yeah, except there's a handful of woody plants that do have green bark though, right? But the bigger problem for me is that some species can be trees or shrubs that will sometimes be different when they're juveniles. Sometimes when they're damaged or when they're overwintering, they're going to be completely different. And even something as basic as whether are the leaves opposite or not, that can change. Some species will have opposite leaves and alternate leaves at the same time on different branches or on the same branch. And sometimes they change with age. Sometimes overwintering leaves might be opposite and the growing season leaves might be alternate. So any approach like this is inherently flawed, basically, because there are always going to be those individual plants of exceptions. And again, I know I'm throwing lots of words at you, talking pretty quickly here, but these are references for you to come back and look at later. The bottom line is the point I'm making here is that even though they're not perfect, keys are useful or wonderful, motifs are going to have some of the same flaws. There's always going to be a plant that's going to challenge you, and that's just we have to embrace that. But the bottom line is if we learn to recognize some basic things like this, and you think, oh, I've got this, a woody opposite, and I look at something like this. If you know pinweeds, this plant here on the left here, they don't look woody to most people, except sometimes they get to be knee high, and they're very, very woody at the base. They actually overwinter with little clusters of leaves to the ground, little rosettes, little creeping stems at the base of the plant. Are they woody or not? Right? Some books say they are, some books don't include them. Partridgeberry, if you know partridgeberry on the right here, this Monticello repens, it's so hard to call that a woody plant, and yet there are books on shrubs that call this a woody plant. It perinates above ground. It has lignified secondary xylem. Okay, it's only half an inch tall, right? But is it really a shrub? Is it a subshrub? Right? So just please keep in mind that as you're trying to sort through this, there's always going to be some plant out there that just kind of stumps you, that leaves you confused. And all I can do is kind of shrug and say, "Yep, welcome to the game." Right? It's not always easy. But ultimately for us, if we step back into the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish here, again, this focus on Arkansas plants that are woody and opposite, we can take a deep breath and remind ourselves, okay, we got this. We can kind of sort this out here. I'm not going to go into the phylogenetic details here other than just pointing out that we only have a couple of gymnosperms, a couple members of the Pineales that are woody and opposite, that all the rest of our woody opposite plants in Arkansas are actually subsets of dicots. The orders here that we see in the red boxes, all of our woody opposite plants in Arkansas fit into these groups, right? And so this is, again, is reference for you to look at down there on your own after the talk is over here. But things like mistletoe, euonymus, St. John's worts, and then the trees that are indicated to the right here. This next bit here, things like dogwoods and buttonbush and gelsemiums and climbing dogvanes. And so what I've done here is essentially created a reference to all of the woody plants in Arkansas that have opposite leaves. And so my goal for today is for you to be able to understand how I organize this information and to come back and use these resources that I've created to help you put names on plants later. Don't expect all this to sink in right now here today, because it is kind of overwhelming and I am going fast, right? Want to clarify, just kind of reiterate that in Arkansas, we don't have any ferns that are woody with opposite leaves. We don't have any baseline angiosperms in Arkansas that are woody with opposite leaves. We don't have any monocots in Arkansas that are woody with opposite leaves. And we do have a couple of gymnosperms. We're basically talking about dicots and subsets of dicots, right? And what do we mean by dicots? Dicot, di meaning two, cot is short for cotyledon, the seedling leaves. Like when a seed first germinates, does it have one seed leaf or two seed leaves or multiple seed leaves, right? And so dicots are the group of organisms, the group of plants that only have two seed leaves. That's not very useful most of the time, right? How are you supposed to know how many seed leaves it's going to have, right? Well, we can characterize most dicots, but not all, because they have broad blades, that expanded photosynthetic part of the leaf, right? They have reticulate veins, which means that there's a primary vein with secondary veins coming off of it. The leaf base is not sheathing. A sheath is the lower part of a leaf that wraps around a stem, right? There are a couple exceptions. There are a few dicots that actually form a slight sheath, right? Worry about that later, basically, right? Dicots also have flowers that are 4 or 5 meris, but we're not going to worry about that today, right? So please keep this in mind that I've already winnowed you down past all the other possible groups of plants, and we're talking about a few select subgroups of dicots, except that there are these two gymnosperms, these two junipers, called red cedar. And so these junipers or cedars have opposite leaves. Like many members of the Cupressaceae do have opposite leaves, not all, but many are opposite, right? And so we have Juniperus ashii and Juniperus virginiana, both here in Arkansas. Otherwise, if you walk up to a plant with opposite leaves, it's going to be an angiosperm. It's specifically a dicot, with the exception of these two junipers and a few cultivated plants, right? So if you know Dawn redwood, it's a gymnosperm that has opposite leaves, opposite branchlets here. It's cultivated. It's one of these living fossils. Dawn redwood, it looks kind of like a bald cypress. Bald cypress has alternate branches, alternate leaves, and then this Dawn redwood has opposite. And what's cool about the bald cypress and the Dawn redwood is that what look like compound leaves here are actually deciduous branchlets, right? The leaves are simple, but they look like little feathery compound leaves. That's just a deciduous branchlet, right? There's a bunch of other members of the Cupressaceae that are also opposite. So for instance, if you know Arborvitae, Platycladus, Thuya, the Chemiciferous, there are several cultivated genera of gymnosperms that are opposite, little scale leaves like this. Right? We can rule those out though, because what we're focused on when we say the woody plants in Arkansas that are opposite is we're primarily thinking once again about angiosperms, not those gymnosperms. But I did have to mention them. And so now we're finally where I wanted to start. And I hope that review was adequate, or hope it wasn't too mundane. But when we walk up to a plant in Arkansas, if you know that it's a dicot, if you see a broad blade with branched veins and a non-sheathing base, you're looking at a dicot, or maybe a basal angiosperm, which is a group we've talked about in the past. And there are 4 major subsets of dicots, and again, artificial groups that have been created for teaching purposes, for ID purposes, right? And MADCap refers to the opposite-leaved plants. It turns out that in Arkansas, we've got 24 families, 33 genera, and 87 species of woody plants with opposite leaves, right? And that's the goal, the focus for today is to go ahead and start talking about those. And so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk going into detail on those, but I just want to stop again for real quick and just ask, are there any questions at this point?
If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute your microphone or drop them in the chat.
Okay, well, so I'll move on. So I apologize for asking about, because it's still really weird to me. I know we've been doing the whole like online thing for a few years now, but it's just still so weird to be sitting here talking to myself, looking at a computer. It's easy to forget that y'all are out there. But if you have questions, please let me know. So the simplified approach to dealing with the woody opposite plants is what called MADCap. And this is one of the motifs that I didn't create. This is a teaching tool that's been around for decades. I don't know how many decades it's been around, but most foresters learn this. A lot of people hear this over the years. And this is kind of part of what gave me the idea. Well, wait, if we're going to use one artificial motif like this, why not use others, right? And so the idea behind MADCap is if you walk up to something that's palmate, if it's woody and opposite and it's palmate, that means it's a maple or relative, right? So the buckeyes are related to maples. If you walk up to something that is compound or has cuticular pits, well, that's the ash or the olive family. A few exceptions, a few things we're leaving out there, right? If you walk up to opposite and woody that's got arcuate veins, like in the picture here, that's a dogwood. And then the default was the honeysuckles. So the cap part was just falling back on the honeysuckles, right? This is an oversimplified approach, and there are people that I've met who learned it as B MADCap, where they would pull out the buckeyes and the elderberry. Well, buckeyes are related to maples, and the elderberry is related to honeysuckles. So, do you really need to pull those out? Should we just stick with MADCap? Do you have to have B MADCap? Right. And it turns out that if you're actually trying to get all of the woody opposite plants, we've also got some Bignoniaceae and some Solasteraceae, the euonymuses, and we've got the hydrangeas to worry about, and we've got a few mints to worry about, and crepe myrtle is sometimes opposite, and the empress tree, and buttonbush, and bladdernut, and there's all these other opposite woody things that have been left out. And why were they left out? Because they're not as common. Because most parts of the state, most areas you go, these aren't things you're going to see. And so we also then I have to add in the mistletoe, the St. John's worts, the gossymium, the Carolina jessamine, climbing dogbane. If you're going to teach all of the woody opposite plants, MADCap doesn't cut it, right? And so I've expanded for my regional flora class. I've expanded MADCap to become poppy MODCaps, and I did that just having fun, trying to find something that was maybe memorable, and that would still sound a little bit like MADCap, right? Poppy is Spanish for like daddy, and so that was part of laughter for me. For me, that's what makes it funny. But the PA stand for palmately compound, the PI stand for pinnately compound. M is still maples. The O is now standing for the Oleaceae. The D is still dogwoods. Cap is still the honeysuckles and relatives or lookalikes. And then the S is where we're going to put in the few things that have stipules, right? And so what we've done here is created a slightly more complex motif that actually accounts for all of the woody opposite things in Arkansas, right? And so we had this mnemonic device that was out there, this MADCap or B MADCap, right? And I've expanded it to be a little bit more inclusive, to be a lot more inclusive now, right? But the question still becomes, well, what do you find confusing? What do you need motifs for, right? What do you need patterns for? If you could keep everything straight in your head, you wouldn't need MADCap or any other approach. You would know everything, right? I like the motifs, and I've worked on them so long and trying to figure them out because I find some plants very confusing. So on the left here, we've got catalpa, and on the right, we have paulownia. They look so similar, right? They are distant cousins. They are distantly related, basically, right? They're so easy to tell apart once you know what you're doing. But at a glance, they look really, really similar to an untrained eye, especially, and even to a trained eye, they can look really similar, right? So let's just want to remind us of this, that whatever motif you use, whatever you find confusing, whatever you want to try to add in this case like this, again, I'm just stressing the fact that when I was first playing with the idea of how to expand MADCap, I was coming up with MADCap sec and MADCap sprinkled, and just I was trying to figure out how do I make some mnemonic device that's memorable, right? So if you find something that's better, please share it with me. I'm happy to incorporate it into what I do. But for now, at least, work in progress. Poppy MODCaps is what we're actually going to talk about, not just MADCap, right? So the PA part again stands for palmately compound, and that's awesome. That's easy because in Arkansas we only have 2 families, 2 genera, and 4 species. We have 2 buckeyes and 2 chase trees, basically. The chase trees are not native. The buckeyes are native. Right? And so that's it. If you see palmately compound, now all you have to do is figure out how to tell vitex from escus. So if you walk up to a plant and you see that the leaves, that the plant is woody, the leaves are opposite and they're palmately compound, how do you tell a buckeye from a chase tree? Well, look at the pictures here and find the words. You know, look at the shape of the leaflets. Look at the margin. Look at the venation. Right. There are all kinds of features that you can use to separate them. Right. And if we had time, we could talk about some of those. But I won't make it very far if I get sidetracked on something like the easy stuff like this. Right. But then if you have questions about where to go from here, please follow up. Please ask. But be 100% aware in your mind that if you walk up to a plant that is woody, opposite, and palmately compound in Arkansas, there's only 2 things it could possibly be. Boom, easy, right? Pinnately compound, again, with all of these, remember that they're going to be woody and opposite, and pinnately compound. There's 5 different families, 6 different genera, and 11 species. Most of those extra species are ashes. The ashes are pretty difficult. We've got 1 maple that's pinnately compound. We've got bladdernut. We've got an elderberry. So we've got bladdernut, elderberry, the box elder or ash leaf maple, and then all the rest are ashes, basically, right? So how do you separate these? Well, again, I mentioned that there's a fuller version of this presentation that has additional pictures and additional words. If you want that extra information, please look at the PDFs that I'm willing to share with you, and then follow up with questions. There just isn't time to go into all the details here. But this is it. We've only got these handful of things to pay attention to. If we find something that's pinnately compound, woody opposite pinnately compound, I'm obviously leaving a couple things off here, right? It says 5 genera, and then I've only listed 4 here. But ultimately, please keep in mind that we're always doing this. We're always cutting corners, leaving things out, to simplify life, right? But follow up if you have questions, because I do address the fuller details in the other presentations, in the addenda to what I have here today. The M, so again, we're doing the poppy MADCaps, the M, the traditional maple. Not only do maples have palmate veins and lobes, but we also have catalpa and paulownia, or the other two genera that are going to be woody, opposite, and palmate. And so if you've ever seen a catalpa tree or a paulownia tree, a Chinese princess tree or a Chinese empress tree, huge leaves, giant leaves, way bigger than any maple will ever be, right? But then the maples are sometimes kind of confusing, especially if you get into all the splitting up of the sugar maples that's been happening. They can be quite confusing. So again, if you want to address how to tell these apart, that's the follow-up presentation that we don't have time for here today. But basically, knowing that there's only 3 families, 3 genera, and the 11 species, those are mostly going to be different species of maple. And we've got 2 different catalpas in Arkansas, paulownia, and then the 8 different maples, basically, right? So again, we've taken this diversity of the 370 plus woody plants in Arkansas. 470 or so woody plants in Arkansas. Only 86 of them have opposite leaves, and of those, only 11 are going to be palmately veined, right? The olive family gets pulled off on its own. It technically includes Fraxinus, but we've already pulled the ashes off as being pinnately compound. With the simple leaved ashes or ash relatives, the rest of the olive family, the Oleaceae, there are 4 more genera in Arkansas. A couple of them are not native. But how do you recognize the Oleaceae? They have the leaves tend to be on these raised wooden pegs. So if you look at this privet down here in the lower right, see that little wooden peg, the petiole bases come down, and there's that little raised wooden peg. You find raised wooden pegs like that in a lot of different families, but within the MADCap motif, within the things that are woody and opposite, if you find a raised wooden peg, there's a very high probability that you're looking at something in the olive family. There are others that do that as well, though, right? But another great character, though, is what I refer to as cuticular pits. If you look at a close-up, so this is a magnified close-up of the underside of a privet leaf, and you see the dark green specks there, the dark green spots. When I was a grad student, I actually anatomically sectioned some leaves, trying to figure out what these dark green spots were. And they're just little holes in the cuticle base. So the cuticle is that waxy layer that's on the leaf to prevent water loss. Well, you can't put a bag over your head and expect to breathe, right? If the stomates are there for breathing, which is we don't call it breathing, it's transpiration, the evapotranspiration that kind of pulls water through plants, right? You can't cover up the stomates and expect there to be gas exchange and water being pulled through the plant, right? So these dark spots, what I'm calling cuticular pits, turned out to be, when I section the leaves, turned out to be little depressions in the cuticle, little holes in the cuticle associated with stomates, right? And yes, all plants you would think would have these cuticular pits, but for some reason, the only family that I can see them in with a hand lens is the olive family, right? So if you walk up to a plant that is woody and opposite and you see cuticular pits with a hand lens, I have to use a hand lens. Some of my students' eyes are good enough to see them without. With those raised wooden pegs, you're probably looking at something in the olive family. And we move on, poppy MADCap. So we're to the D now. So it still stands for dogwoods, the Cornaceae, just one genus, one family. We have 5 species of dogwood in Arkansas, right? Telling them apart is kind of tricky. Some of them are easy, a couple of them are pretty tough. But the arcuate veins. And again, what we mean by arcuate is the secondary veins arch smoothly towards the margin and then curve towards the apex. This kind of like very smooth curve to those secondary veins. That's what we mean by arcuate. And yes, there are a few other plants that do that. But those other plants are generally not going to be opposite and entire. So dogwoods are going to be entire. And I mentioned opposite. What turns out, oops, there's one dogwood that's actually got alternate leaves, and that's talked about in the fuller version of this. Now we get to one of the hardest parts of the whole opposite, the poppy MADCaps or MADCap, the honeysuckle part. Historically, if you're glossing over the details, you would just say honeysuckles, boom, and move on, right? Well, the honeysuckle family got split up and is now 2 different families, the Vibernaceae and the Caprifoliaceae. We've got 3 different genera, 16, what is it, 7, 8, 9 species or so of honeysuckles. And then the 2 genera that are now being called the Vibernaceae. They were also briefly called the Adoxaceae, so names are always changing on us, right? Which is frustrating for us too. But the viburnums make up most of the species. So if you're looking at a honeysuckle, and if you can rule out whether the palmate compound, pinnate compound, being part of the palmate, the vein group, the maples in quotes group, right? If you can rule out the olive family and the dogwood family, the default is to say, well, I think it must be some sort of honeysuckle relative. And it's amazing to me how often that turns out to work globally. So again, I've used this approach in lots of different states, several different countries, and it's amazing how often it works. In other countries, I often have to learn new families as well. But if you walk up to a plant, once again, that is woody and opposite, that lacks all those other features, it's probably a honeysuckle relative, right? You could imprint all the species, but to ID them is kind of tough, right? And it turns out that what we have that also looks like honeysuckles, the lookalikes, right? They're woody, they're opposite, they're simple, they're not olives, they're not dogwoods, they don't have stipules, are things like the climbing dog vein, which is a member of the Postinaceae, the Carolina jessamine, the hydrangeas. Hydrangeas look a lot like viburnums vegetatively. Viburnums and hydrangeas are very easy to confuse sometimes. But I've listed the easiest ways. Viburnums tend to have the terminal bud kind of protected by the bud and by the petiole. And we'll step back over here. If you look at these petiole bases here, you see how the petiole bases are kind of like hugging together, they're like touching. They're protecting that terminal bud. That's a classic viburnum feature, right? So that's one of the easier ways for me vegetatively to recognize a viburnum. Otherwise, knowing viburnum versus hydrangea requires flowers and fruits. Viburnums have 5 stamens, the fruit is a drupe, whereas hydrangeas have 8 stamens with capsules, right? The St. John's wort we already talked about, with the hypericums with their pellucid dots, the mint calicarpa with the square stems, opposite leaves, the smell, and then mistletoe, which is hemiparasitic epiphyte, right? So these are the things that look like honeysuckles, but they can all be pretty easily diagnosed and separated from honeysuckles, right? So we're going to talk about, just very quickly go over those. The thyrsanthella used to be called Trachelospermum, but that was shown to be an artificial group, right? So the climbing dog vein, I always just called it milkweed vine, or it's got other common names as well. But it turns out that they're always going to be entire. They're part of the gentianales, which are almost always entire. They've got collators. If you look at the lower right here, see these kind of dark purple triangles, but along the node between the petiole bases, those are thick multicellular glandular hairs called collators. This particular species is a liana, it's a woody vine. And the reason why it's called diformis or difformis, right? Di meaning 2, forms. This is the same species. These pictures are all the same species. The juvenile leaves are these long, skinny, narrow leaves, and the leaves higher up on the plant are much broader, these kind of broad elliptic leaves, right? Very different leaves. But what do they have in common? They're opposite, simple, and entire with milky sap. If you find a plant that is opposite, simple, and entire with milky sap, you've just found something in the milkweed family, the dogbane family, the Apocinaceae. And we only have one that's a woody vine here in Arkansas, and that's this climbing dogbane, right? So if you find a plant that is opposite simple and entire with milky sap, you've got something in the milkweed or dogbane family, right? And if it's a vine with these two different shaped leaves that actually perinates above ground, there's only one in Arkansas that could be, and that's this Thursendella. The Carolina jessamine, also called yellow jasmine or Carolina jessamine, and people mix those all around, right? You can see the same thing here. It's in the same order. It's also part of the gentianales, and this is where understanding phylogeny matters. Right? Gentianales are all going to be simple, opposite, and entire with collators. So if we look in the upper left here, see these kind of darker triangular structures at the node, thick multicellular glandular hairs. When I see opposite, simple, and entire with collators, I know that I'm looking at something that's related to the gentianales, something in the gentianales, right? The gentianaceae, rubiaceae, apocinaceae, in this case, gelsemiaceae, right? And so these things look kind of sort of like honeysuckles. They don't have milky sap, so it's not a milkweed. They've got superior ovaries. They've got capsules. They've got yellow flowers. These are features that you don't typically find. Well, you don't. The honeysuckles are always going to be berries. The true honeysuckle, the genus Lemissa, is going to be berries, right? The flowers that we do have one native honeysuckle that's got yellow flowers, but honeysuckles aren't usually yellow flowered, right? But the honeysuckles also have inferior ovaries. And so at some point in time, you can imprint the species, right? The fact that our native Carolina jessamine is more or less glabrous. Sometimes it's got a few small hairs on it, but most of our common weedy, viney honeysuckles are going to be pubescent, are going to have hairs, right? The leaf shape is different. So the bottom line is you can learn to imprint these things, but for now, at least, as long as you can diagnose and say, aha, if I see a vine that's woody and opposite, if I see a vine that is woody and opposite, I'm probably looking at something related to a honeysuckle or something that looks like a honeysuckle. Then please keep Carolina jessamine as part of your kind of repertoire of what it might be, right? So moving on to hydrangeaceae, we've got three different genera here in Arkansas. There's actually more than three in Arkansas because we've got some cultivated ones as well. But there are three that are reported as either established or native in Arkansas. Decomaria, the climbing hydrangea. These bottom four pictures are actually a vine that you find in swamps, kind of a woody vine, a liana that you find in swamps. The juvenile leaves can be strongly toothed. The adult leaves can be more or less entire and much bigger. But the hydrangeas, the Philadelphus, the mock oranges, we've got some of those here in Arkansas, right? And the third is something called Deutzie. It's a cultivated plant that has been reported as naturalized sparingly or rarely in Arkansas, right? And so this is for me as a family or group that when I see it, I'm like, okay, woody, opposite, and it lacks all the other features. Okay, so this is some sort of honeysuckle looking thing, some sort of honeysuckle relative. It does not have, if you look at the hydrangea here in the lower right corner, it does not have the viburnum petioles. And if it were a viburnum, the petioles would be protecting that terminal bud. The terminal bud wouldn't be sitting up there by itself. The petioles would be coming together and protecting that terminal bud if it were a viburnum. So basically, when I see a hydrangea, I look at it and say, huh, it kind of reminds me of a viburnum, but the terminal bud is all wrong for a viburnum. If there's flowers and fruits, that's when it gets easy. But without flowers, I have to look at that terminal bud to know for sure if I'm looking at something in the hydrangea family. The St. John's worts we've talked about. It turns out there's 20 different species of St. John's worts in Arkansas in 1920, depending on how you split the species up, and only about 8 of them are woody. So we have most of our St. John's worts are herbs basically, right? Like this one in the upper right corner here is called penweed. The Hypericum. I've mislabeled that. That was a typo on my part. It should have said Hypericum gentianoides. So I apologize for that. I'll try to fix that. But the upper right corner is not Hypericum hypericoides. It's Hypericum gentianoides. I apologize for the typo. So we have even the woody hypericums range from kind of like ankle high, like this Hypericum stragulum, which some people call Hypericum hypericoides, variety multicolli. No, it's a different species. It needs to be treated as a species. But that's ankle high, all the way to something like Hypericum prolificum, which can be waist high, even sometimes rarely shoulder high, right? So hypericums are highly variable. And in fact, some of y'all might be familiar with the pink flowered St. John's worts that grow in marshes, right? They used to be called a different genus, but it's been shown fairly clearly that the pink flowered St. John's worts are actually, or marsh St. John's worts are actually just part of the genus Hypericum now. Most Hypericums have yellow flowers, yellow petals, except for the marsh. There's 3 or 4 species of pink flowered ones that we have, right? And so again, the key thing about the Hypericums is those pellucid dots, being simple opposite entire pellucid dots. Nothing else in Arkansas that it can be besides the Hypericum. And moving on here to the mint, this Calicarpa beautyberry. Okay, it's toothed. Most mints have toothed leaves. Sometimes, rarely entire, but most mints have teeth. The stems are usually square, and in the beautyberry, the young stem will be slightly square if you feel it carefully. The older stems won't be obvious. The smell, you get a distinctive smell with beautyberry, and that is a mint feature, right? What sets beautyberry apart from most of the other mints is that it's got these really cool, weird hairs that are branched called dendritic hairs. And so this close up here, it's kind of like stellate hairs, except that the hairs are actually branched. So essentially the hairs have branches of their own, right? So beautyberry. So again, it's easiest to imprint all these things, but if you're diagnosing these things, woody, simple, opposite, squarish stems, teeth, that's the kind of stuff that you look at, right? And then mistletoe, the last of these kind of honeysuckle lookalikes in a broad sense. It looks nothing like a honeysuckle, but in terms of categories, it fits here, right? It's an epiphyte, which means it's a plant that grows on another plant. Epi meaning on or above, and then phyte referring to plant, right? It's a hemiparasite, which means a half parasite. Notice that it's green. It makes its own food. It still photosynthesizes. It has chlorophyll. It makes its own food. But if a plant is growing on another plant, where does it get its water? Right? So it has specialized roots called haustoria, which penetrate the xylem of the host plant and actually tap into the water in the xylem from the host plant, right? So mistletoes don't directly kill their hosts. No good parasite wants to kill its host, right? You kill your host, you die, kind of thing, right? So mistletoes don't generally kill the host plants. However, if the host plant's already suffering, already dying, already struggling, mistletoes might actually increase the likelihood of the host plant dying. But generally speaking, parasites do not kill their hosts, right? So people that think that mistletoes are killing the trees, yeah, no, they might be helping it die faster, but they're not going to kill the tree directly, right? But that said, mistletoes are woody, simple, opposite. They're entire, but they're the only epiphyte. They're the only MADCap epiphyte that you're going to find in Arkansas, right? And so it's very easy to diagnose. And the last little group here, moving on to the stipules now, the S for stipules. We have 4 families, 4 genera, 8 species of plants in Arkansas that can have stipules. And most of those 8 species are in the genus Euonymus, right? So we've got Cephalanthus, the buttonbush, which has these interpetiolar stipules, part of the coffee family. We've got crepe myrtle, which can be opposite or alternate. And then we've got the Euonymus, the thing called things like wahoo or hearts are bursting with love. I mean, lots of different common names there. And then we also have these occasional members. Sorry, if you've ever heard of paper mulberry, basically. And what I mean by occasional is I don't see a whole lot of it around here in southeastern Arkansas, but other parts of the state I've seen a lot more of it. Its leaves are alternate or opposite, so it does both, right? It'll do both. It also has milky sap. So this is kind of one of those plants that blurs the lines. It fits more than one motif. When you have alternate leaves, you can't be MADCap, right? But with opposite leaves, that is MADCap. So if you find a MADCap that's got the opposite leaves but has teeth and lobes like this with milky sap, that's got to be paper mulberry. There's nothing else it could possibly be in Arkansas. And so ultimately, I've kind of rushed through that, and I'm actually kind of finishing a few minutes early here, but it doesn't have to be finished. I'm happy to answer questions. As I mentioned, there are other presentations that I pulled together here today, and I'm just going to go ahead and I want to save myself a couple minutes here to show you these. Basically, what we have here is more details where I go through family by family and say, okay, and I talk about the different species, and I show lots of different pictures of all the different species and the different genera. And so if you want to study these groups that I've talked about, if you want to go back and study the palmately compound ones, I've pulled pictures together of those. If you then want to study the pinnately compound ones, I've pulled those together. I've even done my best to try to sort out all these confusing ashes. And so essentially what we have here is a longer presentation that goes through all the different families, the genera, the species, and tries to talk about them in greater detail. And so I would love to spend the next 4 or 5 hours going through all of that, but obviously there's not time for that. But what I want to do now, though, is go ahead and just kind of open the floor to any questions. If you want me to talk about any specific group or answer any specific questions, I'm happy to. But what you've just been exposed to are the families, genera, and a very broad sense species of woody plants in Arkansas that have opposite leaves. So I guess I'll just stop talking and ask if there's any questions now.
Thank you, Richard. That was another amazing presentation, and I know many of us would love to have you go on for 4 or 5 more hours also. Maybe we can have you back to kind of go more in depth into some of these different motifs. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute your microphone. You can ask Richard directly, or you can drop it in the chat. While we're waiting, I did want to read a couple of comments that we had in the chat from Karen Seal. She was really grateful for the review, and found it very helpful, and also that was an interesting, creatively expanded motif. Obviously, you put a lot of thought into the modification. She thanks you for that. So,
thanks, Karen.
anybody want to ask Dr. Abbott a question while we have him? And I have dropped his email in the chat. I'll go ahead and do it again for those of you who have joined us a little later. That way you have it and you can request those slides from him. He'd be happy to send those to you.
And I will go ahead and just point out that what I have that's kind of email compatible are PDFs of basically, essentially the presentation was too large. I had to split it into 4 separate PDFs to make them small enough to email readily. If you don't like the quality of the images in the PDFs, figure out some way to do some sort of Google Docs share drive, some sort of online something or other, right? I'm happy to share the original PowerPoints with you. They're just too big to put into emails, basically. But the PDFs are useful for most people, for most purposes, should be useful. And I'm happy to email those to you. Just drop me an email and let me know.
I have a couple more comments. Ann Greenwood says, wonderful presentation. Thanks so much. Definitely makes the identification easier. Petra says, wow, I am now going to really study leaf patterns, and by doing that, attempt to identify some of the trees on our property. Thank you for the information. Please share the PDF with me.
Oh, just email me and I'll be happy to do that.
Last call for questions. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us, Dr. Abbott. We're really grateful for all that you do to educate us on the native plants of Arkansas and your wonderful programs and webinars that you've provided over the years. So I want to thank everyone else also for being with us here today. This recording, the recording of this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so please check that out and subscribe. You'll find recordings of all of our past webinars going back to, I believe, 2020 is when we started this series. You can find out more information about the Arkansas Native Plant Society on our website at anps.org, or you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Arkansas Native Plant Society. You can join us by going to amps.org/join. Of course, you can also learn more about the native plants of Arkansas from our blog, Know Your Natives, or from our YouTube channel. And with that, we will sign off and thank you once again.
Thank you.